Today I am joined by Peter Elam. Peter is an impressive guest, I will say. We've got an ex-president, or previous president, should I say, of the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors. Peter also spent 15 years of his career at Shell, one of the biggest companies in the world, right? I guess. And he's also spent time at Novartis. He's currently the group head of risk and assurance at Anglo American. He's here today to talk to me about a very specific topic. I'll go into that in a minute. But first of all, welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Julia. Really nice to be here today.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. How's your year started?
Pretty good. For us, the beginning of the year is relatively quiet. We're primarily kind of looking back on the work that we've done over the previous 12 months. We're putting reports together, talking to management, preparing to go and talk to the audit committee, and taking a little bit of a breather, because usually the end of the year, December, is very, very intense for us. People trying to finish the work, get the reports out. And it's also about looking forward.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody about this yesterday, actually. The amount of time that you spend actually preparing and then going to audit committee. How much of your time, if you're thinking about a month, how much of your month is spent preparing for that one meeting?
Well, it obviously depends on whether in that month I'm going to the audit committee or not. But I go to the audit committee. I also go to our board sustainability committee. And so between the two, there must be 6 meetings a year, perhaps 7. And so, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much every other month, if you like. And in such a month, I would spend probably at least 5 days just on that. But it's hard sometimes to disentangle what is working towards that and what is not, because it's kind of the culmination of our work for the period. It's the cherry on the cake of all the work that we've done is the report to the audit committee. And we've got to get it right. We've got to somehow do justice to all the hard work that all the team have done over that period, and give management a chance to respond and hopefully nudge them a bit to improving things.
Absolutely. How terrified were you on your first audit committee?
Pretty scared. It helped that I had I was told I was only allowed to talk for 5 minutes, and then I had to take questions. I'm personally quite comfortable taking questions, but I was very nervous about how do I fit it into 5 minutes without talking like a robot on speed. But after a couple of meetings, got into the routine. And of course, each audit committee is different. Depends also on who the different members are. One thing I did, which I really recommend, is to meet the audit committee members individually before the meeting, or at least, if you can, soon after the first meeting, to get them to know them personally, so that when they pitch a question, you can more or less guess where they're coming from. Because I think that's the hardest thing in a very short meeting. Board meetings are typically quite short, quite focused. You need to have an answer, and you need to guess a bit. What is it they really have in mind? Because otherwise, the time's gone.
Absolutely.
It's different from going and speaking to a management meeting.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
I have to say, one of my lifelong ambitions is to go to an audit committee meeting. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do that. I might ask heads of audit if I can shadow. Do you reckon that'll be possible?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it would need to be agreed with the audit committee chair, but you could. What you could try to do is engineer that you have a little slot on recruitment or staffing, and then you could go along and give the independent perspective.
Yeah.
And so that ought to be possible. Before you ask if you can do it with Anglo American, I'm not promising anything, but we can try.
I look forward to that.
Yeah.
I look forward to it. Maybe 24, maybe 25.
Right.
Perfect. Right, let's get into the topic today, which is a really interesting one, because I started my career 10 years ago in internal audit recruitment, and I think this is probably one of the first statements that I heard. Internal audit must be independent. Third line, it should be detached from the businesses as much as possible. We're here to talk today about, we're asking the question, is internal audit truly independent? should it be truly independent? So I'm going to ask the first question for anybody who's listening to this and perhaps isn't in internal audit but wants to go into internal audit in the future. How would you explain, first of all, the context around internal audit being independent?
Yeah. Well, I think it's one of the trickiest topics, actually, around internal audit, is how independent is it? It is somewhat independent. So in the sense that you'll have a certain organizational independence. Usually the head of internal audit has a functional reporting line to the chair of the audit committee. I'll come back to that. That's very important. And then at least an administrative reporting line to somebody in management, but usually top management, the CFO, typically the CEO, sometimes. And the point of that is to make sure that if you're going to audit something, you're not frankly kind of dependent on who you're auditing for your performance appraisal, your bonus, anything like that. So you can give your independent perspective on their work or on what you're auditing. That's what we mean by independence. Now, there are some limits to that. I think firstly, internal audit, as you can tell from the name, is internal to the organisation. These are colleagues of yours in your organisation. A lot of organisations have quite a collegiate type of culture where you're expected to kind of get on with your colleagues. There's a social side to it, which, as a minimum involves having coffee with people from time to time, having lunch without necessarily always talking business. And so there is and I think for an external person, for the proverbial person on the street, I'm not sure they would see internal audit as being particularly independent. I think we have to bear that in mind. I think and what I've experienced, I've been in internal audit for about 20 years now, previously in finance. The emphasis on independence kind of ebbs and flows a bit. After the financial crisis, 2008, there was a much stronger emphasis on independence, and also a little bit earlier than that, after the introduction of the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation.
Yeah.
The 3 lines model, when it was brought in, 3 lines of defence, as it was first called, that was what, 15 years ago or so, maybe slightly longer. That also stressed the independence of the 3rd line. I think before that, however, internal audit was frequently not terribly independent. We report. When I first started an internal audit at Shell in 2003, we reported to the head of finance consulting.
What?
Yeah, if you can believe it. So that wasn't really independent, and
No.
So and then then it gradually changed. But I think nowadays there's a little bit less emphasis on the independence and a bit more on what is the how can we make a constructive contribution? After all, in the end, we're all in the same boat. We want to have a more effective organisation, better risk management, more effective controls, and that's not necessarily helped by kind of criticising from the outside. I think it's your internal audit at best is a kind of critical friend. Yeah, the friend who tells you the things that you don't really want to hear.
Yeah.
But you listen because that person has your interests in mind, that they're not, that they are loyal. I think that's the best way of seeing it. And we can go further into the kind of ins and outs of what that really means. But I suppose my own view has changed a bit. I think also as you get more experience, you get more confident that you are independent and nobody can take it away from you. And but you don't need to be you don't need to draw a lot of attention to it. A bit like being a doctor, a GP, if you like. You need to be effective. You need to be quite close to your patients. You need to understand your patients, build a certain rapport. But I don't think these days anybody would say that a GP is not independent of their patients. That's the kind of relationship I think we should strive for. With that, however, goes the professionalism. Again, the doctor-patient analogy is important because you expect your GP to be professional, and you also expect your GP to be honest with you when you have a problem.
Yeah.
You don't expect, especially these days, we don't expect doctors to kind of for the sake of the patient, in inverted commas, not tell the patient that they have a really bad health problem. These days, ethically, the expectation would be you better tell the patient, but before you do so, you better do very, very thorough professional work, if necessary, again, to double check that you've got the right diagnosis. And I think the same duty is on the shoulders of internal auditors.
You're right. You wouldn't. Yeah. I mean, I certainly wouldn't go to a GP and be upset with the GP if the GP told me they'd found something. I wouldn't automatically go, "You're wrong. You're getting defensive." Yeah. I don't know. Maybe some people do.
Well, people do.
Do they?
Oh yes, and they certainly do with an internal audit, as I'm sure you know, and I'm sure many of those listening today have witnessed. But don't get. In my experience, it's important not to get too excited about that. For goodness sake, don't fight back. You wouldn't expect your doctor to, even if you shouted at your doctor, you wouldn't expect your doctor to shout back. And bear in mind that is often a stage that the person is going through in accepting, and I put the emphasis on the word accepting, something they don't want to hear. Because if they're angry or upset, at least they've heard it. Much worse is when they don't hear the message, and that happens too.
Oh, really?
Or they hear it, but it goes into the proverbial waste paper basket straight away. I've had that too. That's worrying, and that's where you have to go a level up. Yeah. You really, at that point, you really have to go a level up in the organisation and say, look, we have a problem. I'm not sure at that level of the organisation, the person in charge recognises it. I think we need to talk. It's actually more important to do it at that stage than if the person gets very excited and emotional. I believe you if they get very excited and emotional, you need to take a deep breath and be a little bit compassionate, to be honest. Because it can be they can believe that their career is on the line, etc.
And that must be worse in times of economic struggle. I mean, last year was a good example. Last year was very difficult for lots of organisations, and I imagine that the role of an internal auditor was challenging during COVID. It was challenging during last year. Yes, it will be challenging again if we ever go into a recession. Yeah, that must be quite a difficult conversation to have with people, because it's not about sometimes just their job. It's personal, isn't it?
Well. It can be, yes, and I think on the other hand, in times of difficulty, when organisations are going through difficulty, there is, and I'm, experiencing it right now. Those who follow Anglo-American in the news will know we have challenges like other companies, actually, there is more interest and more receptiveness for the risk and assurance work, risk and internal audit work than when everything's going fine. Yeah. Because when things are going well, the reaction tends to be, come on guys, just get out of my way. Let me make some money. Let me make lots of money. And what is this? You keep nagging me about governance. It's not that important, is it? Whereas when people are in difficulty, there is a bit more, well, okay, I know I've got a problem. I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure where the problem really is. Maybe internal audit can help. After all, at least they're going to give me an honest perspective. And this again goes to the independence. When the stress on the organisation, people within the core of the organisation, for them it's actually harder to give bad news, because the CEO may be under a lot of personal stress. And may be more inclined to act out or shoot the messenger, so the internal audit function actually can gain in value because they can be trusted still to give the honest view. And in my experience, just to be clear, the CEO doesn't want to shoot the messenger, or at least 95% of the time is not going to do that. but they find it very difficult to get to get an honest view, particularly when times are difficult, or actually also when times are easy, because people don't then want to draw attention to the problems or the flies in the ointment.
Well, I once heard, it was years ago actually, I once heard somebody say, and I can't remember who this was, but they believe there should be really a fourth line of defence, the fourth line being exit interviews, or being a perspective, or I guess whistleblowing, but really more so exit interviews, because actually how honest ever is anybody's perspective when you're in an organisation. You've always got an agenda, haven't you? When you're in an organisation, you want to keep your job safe, or you've got that in mind, whereas when you've left an organisation, that's where sometimes the really interesting information can come out. And actually, if I think about when I left my previous organisation, I had no exit interview, and that was a FTSE organisation. And it begs the question, how much might they have discovered from me if I'd have given that exit interview? Probably internal audit would have found some things quite interesting. So have you ever heard that before? Is that something that you would ever look at as well?
So exit interviews are potentially quite valuable, and I think most organisations don't really do them properly and systematically.
No.
Partly because they don't really want to hear, and there is psychologically, particularly in large organisations, a bit of but small ones too, a bit of this attitude, well, the person's leaving, so who cares what they have to say. I would question whether everybody would be honest in an exit interview. I certainly would not be fully honest, because because I would be looking still to the old organisation to give me a reference. I've still got relationships. I've got an ongoing, professional standing, and I'm not going to want to burn any bridges. To be honest, I mean, when I say I wouldn't be honest, I don't mean I would be dishonest, but I might not say everything. And if I did, I would be pretty careful, probably. But you touch on an important point, which is that it's very important that as internal audit, we don't believe we've got the monopoly on knowledge about the organisation. That's critical, and we ought to. There's a lot of people working at the moment on what we call combined assurance or aligned assurance, where we work with others in the organisation who are doing audit type activity to try to kind of coordinate the work, get a common picture. I think equally it's important that we, as internal audit, consider other sources, other kind of independent or semi-independent sources of information about the organisation. So employee surveys is I think a pretty good measure. Most of them are set up these days pretty much guaranteeing anonymity. There's usually a lot of slicing and dicing of the data. It's usually done by an independent external organisation, so it's difficult to game. One disadvantage I find is that when the organisation is going through difficulty, there tends to be less of an inclination to run the employee surveys.
Yes, well, they cost, right? There's a cost.
And people are all terribly busy. We shouldn't bother them so much. But again, I think it's because perhaps people don't want to know quite how challenged morale is at that time, which I think is a shame. But there are other sources. In my organisation, I also run the whistleblowing hotline and the investigations group, and that's a fantastic source of information on the organisation. Plus, within our internal audit work, we run risk culture audits where we do explicitly look at sources of information like exit interviews, where they're available. But I'm afraid that the availability is pretty patchy.
Well, even if you think about independence, you even think about referencing. So referencing is, in my opinion, a joke. I don't know why we do referencing anymore. There's no point. You can't say anything negative. You can't, because unfortunately, the society we live in now, if you say something negative and it stops somebody from getting a job, which we shouldn't do, we shouldn't stop somebody getting a job, but actually we should also, out of fairness, I guess, to the next employer, be able to share honest feedback if it's going to be something they should know. And We're too afraid as a society to even give a reference nowadays. So it becomes difficult.
Referencing is really tricky. I've given lots of references, and people have given references about me. I think the biggest problem is that if there's a massive issue, then almost certainly the person giving the reference won't be able to say because of confidentiality.
Yeah.
And because generally speaking, I think this has always been the case. You shouldn't really agree to give a reference unless you're going to give a fairly positive one.
Yeah.
I've had the experience of having to write the reference for the person giving the reference. Even though generally in the UK, people don't, recruiters and companies don't like to have written references. Sometimes that's the only thing that somebody will offer, and I have had the experience where I've written the reference, trying to reflect what I sincerely believe the person would say, and then they've tweaked it and sent it. I obviously haven't seen how they tweaked it, but I don't know. I mean, you probably know better than me, Julia, why we really need references. But I've asked myself the same question.
I just think it's now such a pointless activity. You rarely get anything out of it. You get dates, which sometimes can throw up something because the dates might not be the same as the dates on the CV.
There is that. I mean, you might spot that somebody has inaccurately described their experience. That's probably the serious side of it. And that's of course terrible. But from what one hears, not uncommon that people exaggerate on their CV. Why people do it, however, beats me. But
it's not uncommon.
It's not perhaps not so common amongst internal auditors or at the level of professionals that you're recruiting for.
Oh, you say that. I've got some stories.
Oh, okay.
I won't go into them here.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about reporting lines to create that independence. So what do you think? What is your opinion here? What should the reporting lines look like for internal audit?
Well, the most important thing is that the head of internal audit should have a reliable and functional reporting line to the audit committee. And in practice, that means to the chair of the audit committee. That's critical. And what does that mean? That means that the audit chair of the audit committee should definitely interview the head of internal audit for the role. In my view, should be coordinating the recruitment process. Although that's a bit difficult because generally that is kind of left to management.
Yeah.
But I think if not actually coordinating, then pretty much kind of very much in the panel, and then the head of internal audit should agree their objectives with the chair of the audit committee. There should be performance reviews, the performance of the head of internal audit as well as the function. They should be should be discussed at the audit committee, obviously privately. The bonus probably in the end will be calibrated within the management population. So whoever administratively the head of internal audit reports to will probably have a pretty big say. But again, the chair of the audit committee should be consulted.
Yeah.
And then of course very importantly, if it comes to kind of exit time, it certainly shouldn't be that the chair of the audit committee is just sort of informed that management's decided that they don't fancy working with that individual anymore. And I think these days, on the whole, that there's more substance to that than there certainly was 10 or 20 years ago. I'm going to, if I may, I'm going to put a little plug in for the new global internal audit standards, because I'm on the Global Internal Audit Standards Board, and we've just as many people will know, we've just published the new standards, and there we go into quite some detail about how that relationship with the audit committee should work, and what the audit committee needs to do to make it work. We shied away from saying this is what the audit committee must do, because we felt, well, we can't. It's not really for us to say, but we framed it more in terms of what are the essential conditions, is the term we came up with. Yeah. And it's really worth a read, because it sets out, I think, quite nicely in the end kind of how that relationship should work. I think, however, the relationship with management also needs to have a certain constructive dynamic to it, and in a sense not enough is discussed about how that should really work. Okay. So we say, well, internal audit needs to have an administrative relationship with the CFO or CEO, which means, I mean, at the extreme, just a kind of pay and rations relationship. But actually, it's much more important than that. Yeah. The head of internal audit needs a top management person to kind of guide them and help them navigate a little bit through the organization, help them judge how to get the message across, and, frankly, help them out a bit sometimes in some of the tougher meetings. If I go to the top exec, it's quite important to have a fairly solid ally around the table, but who can then be a kind of critical ally, and in a sense the roles are switched. Yes. They can be the critical friend. That's really important, because the value of internal audit, and my view on this, it probably has changed over time, is not in writing punchy, wonderfully crafted internal audit reports. It's in the change that then comes as a result, and that change depends on management of the company much more than it does depend directly on the auditors. It depends. Again, it's a bit like the doctor-patient relationship. The doctor's true interest is in the well-being of the patient, one hopes, and not in just generating doctor's fees, and that's really, really critical. So that dynamic, I think, is what it's all about in a well-functioning relationship.
I've not thought of it that way before. Yeah. Do you sometimes have to sort of pick your battles?
In what sense, Julian?
So you were saying there about, it's actually about the change.
Yeah.
It's not about having this amazing report that maybe flags everything. It's about actually what is the most important change? What's the biggest risk? What's the most important change? So do you sometimes have to just pick your battles and maybe actually something is more severe than you've represented, but because you just want to see the change, you decide not to go quite as hard on that, because you know that if you did do that, there'd be defence, whereas actually if you were almost not going quite into battle, just approaching it, maybe that would be the thing that creates the change. I've never thought that before.
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I'm smiling because I'm kind of reflecting on that. Yes, of course, as always, you need to pick your battles, but it's a bit more subtle than that, I think. Firstly, ideally, you want the struggle to be taking place in the organisation itself, and I've seen this often, is that actually internal audit will come with a message, and then the reaction will be typically the CEO giving typically one of the business heads a really hard time. That's the battle that needs to take place. Mm-hmm. And there you need to be, but the word battle is obviously a bit dramatic and sounds as if somebody's going to kind of come to a sticky end.
It's like sharp.
You don't want anybody to come to a sticky end. That's not really the point. The point is that there needs to be that change always comes with struggle, but you do want the struggle to take place, but it shouldn't be a struggle between internal audit and the organisation. It should be what you're trying to do is work with your work and with your messaging, is you're trying to get the organisation to itself struggle with the change. It's a bit manipulative in a way, and to do that, you do have to a little bit dose your messaging, and you certainly need to be careful how you frame the messaging, because, for instance, if you need to help. You're more kind of catalyst than anything else, I would say, and you need to you need to be careful. I'm not really a chemist, but I remember from school chemistry, if you put, I think if you put too much catalyst in, then the experiment goes wrong or whatever. But and big change takes a long time, certainly in a large organization.
I can imagine.
So we're still on the change that we signaled was really necessary when I kind of first came in 4.5 years ago. We're still on that journey.
Wow.
And so it's almost more like a campaign than a battle, and you need to. It's not that if you've ever read War and Peace, that's a sort of spectacular, epic story of this great campaign of Napoleon in Russia.
I watched the BBC drama. That was good.
There you are. And I mean, it's sometimes a bit. That's why I was smiling. It's sometimes a bit more like that. That there is there's occasionally a bit of blood and guts, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to cause often quite big change to take place, and it's the change is off. The other thing that we always need to remember in internal audit, the big changes that we might stimulate, we mustn't think it's because of us or because of internal audit there's changes. Often it's not. Often it's the message from internal audit. It pairs up with another message that the board is getting, and then itself goes with a shift within the industry. I mean, we've in Anglo American we've done a lot of audits in mining operations. We found quite early on some unexpected issues, and then there were some unexpected operational incidents, and then you see the board pair that together, and then top management pair that together and say, hang on, something's not right here. We need to do something. So you need to, particularly I think as head of the function, you need to get a sense. Okay, what else is happening? What other messages are coming up? How can I pair up, for instance, with another senior person, another semi-independent senior person in the organisation, because you've got lots of other. You've got the head of safety. You've got the head of legal. These are also fairly independent people. How can I be the ally with one of my colleagues to try to get a message across to achieve the change that we want to achieve? That's I think the real that's the real art in the role.
It's funny when it sort of begs the question, doesn't it? What on earth happened at the post office?
Well,
that there wasn't multiple people coming forward with something. I don't know quite how that happened. That's a podcast in itself, isn't it? But
it's also a very, very good book. The Nick Wallace book about the post office, which has been out for over 2 years now, is fantastic. I mean, I've read it, and there is more coming out because of these hearings that are taking place. It was not. But if you look in the index of Nick Wallace's book, which is thick, it's like 600 pages. I regret to say that internal audit does not appear in the index. So apparently,
at all,
not once. And I don't remember, from having read it, I don't remember any reference to internal audit work as such, except perhaps kind of in passing. So the internal audit function was not apparently really engaged in the quality of the Horizon system, or if they were perhaps not looking at the right risks. But again, to then blame it on internal audit, I think would be a bit much. An awful lot of other people seem to be either looking the wrong way, or indeed covering things up, and there was plenty of covering up going on. That's clear if you read the book.
It's on my list actually. I've been listening to the podcast, and I can't quite tell how much the podcast is similar to the book, but I need to get onto that. I guess that brings us on to another question, and you've already touched upon it: the bonus. Should internal audit get bonus? Should they get a bonus? This might have to be edited out.
It's a lovely question. I think if one took a purist view, the answer would have to be no. I think you would have to say, the board doesn't get a bonus. The board members don't get a bonus. In some companies, they do have to hold a certain amount of company stock, of company shares, so that they have kind of skin in the game.
Yeah.
I think that would make sense for the head of internal audit to have some shares.
Yeah.
Which you might give the head of internal audit. Should they have a bonus? I'm obviously conflicted because it's very nice to get a bonus, and I certainly wouldn't want to give mine up.
Have it as cash instead.
I think that there's certainly risks in giving, particularly when the bonus is tied to the performance of the company, which most bonuses are. My bonus is also, at least in part, tied to the performance of the company. Yeah. I think, however, the head of internal audit should also be trying to find ways to improve the performance of the company. So as long as the bonus KPIs are the right bonus KPIs, which one would hope they are, then the head of internal audit should have should also be incentivized. But there obviously, I can hear already people on the podcast kind of wincing, but there is with that a great danger, of course, that if you have sales as the main KPI, which sometimes it is, then the head of internal audit won't want to raise issues about sales. I hope that I and others would have sufficient integrity to be able to see beyond that and think more about the future bonuses in this organisation, where I hope to be there also in the future as well as this year. Yeah. I
think that's why I find it quite interesting that we're seeing more and more. I mean, you mentioned earlier that you moved from finance into internal audit, but we're seeing a bit of a trend where the head of internal audit is the head of internal audit, top job, is somebody who's just moved into that role from a finance role or from a business role. And I often sort of wonder how used to this dynamic, how used to being independent they are, because if you're a very senior individual who's been in a business for a long time, been in more commercial roles for a long time, and then you move into this position, that must be really difficult to make that move. You're having to you're wearing a different hat completely, aren't you? Do you think about that?
I think it's very hard. I think about it quite a lot, and I know, I know lots of other heads of internal audit. Some of them kind of worked their way up. Some of them came in internally from another part of the finance function. I say another part because in many organisations, internal audit is kind of part of the finance function. Some people come in from the Big Four, for instance. I think all the routes are plausible, but each one comes with a risk. I think the risk of somebody who's kind of coming up through the ranks, particularly if it's all within the same organisation, is that they're a little bit that they might be a little bit too kind of locked in to the way that internal audit is doing things. That may be unfair that I say that, but and also the dynamic of the role as head of internal audit is very different from the role one step down. It's a big step up, to be honest.
Is it?
Yes, because you're you're playing a different game. You're playing the senior leadership game, not the internal audit game so much. Yeah. I think that's why it can be good to have somebody from the business come in, from outside internal audit within the company. That's how I came into internal audit originally. But the risk there is that they underestimate the complexity of and the professional requirements of especially these days of internal audit as a function. And you do see that sometimes that there's some difficulty to adjust with that. I would certainly recommend that anybody doing that would listen very, very carefully to their to their direct reports about how the auditing work should really be done. Be slow to judge that, both positively and negatively, I should say, and just slowly build up a picture, because it is different. It's not it's not the same as. I mean, certainly when I started internal audit, my belief was it was a kind of opinionated financial controlling, and it's not that, particularly not these days.
No.
And then I don't really have direct experience from Big Four into the roles, but that can often be a struggle for different reasons, which is that working in corporates is very different from working in a partnership.
Absolutely.
And that can be a big challenge. So things move generally quite slowly. There's all this coalition building. People are not necessarily very receptive to new ideas. You can be very senior coming from a Big Four firm, but not have that social equity within the organisation. That's very important in senior roles. By social equity, I mean knowing people, having a certain reputation, and because many organisations are quite kind of resistant to outsiders. Shell was where I was, and Anglo to some extent, and that can be tricky.
Yeah, I've always wondered, if that must be such a difficult move across, and actually you mentioned there about that step up to being a head of audit. We're going to hopefully do an event later on this year where we're basically supporting the number twos. We're supporting people who are currently in a senior manager position who do one day want to be a head of audit. Actually giving them the guidance before they make that step up, because I imagine it's quite a daunting.
It's a big
first
step.
Day.
It's a big step. I mean, you're typically going from managing a small team to managing a much bigger team. You're more directly exposed to conflicts with senior management. Often, even the CEO or the CFO. That can be pretty scary if you're, if you've come from a junior role, because of course the head of internal audit is relatively junior to the top execs, although of course in the banks the idea is that they should be at the same level. Whether they really are, I think is moot, but I mean it's not an obvious easy step, but people make the step, and many do so very successfully. So
you've just got to find your feet, haven't you? And I think what Guy will always say is that at that point it's less about the technical. It's always more about your ability to influence. It's performance, right? It's almost having to make sure that you are really stepping into that audit committee, and you've got 5 minutes, and you've got 5 minutes to be impactful. That's
really that's often, I think, the biggest challenge. But and it depends also what type of education you've had, whether you've been sort of trained earlier on to do that. I think what's good these days is that there's much more access to things like mentoring than there used to be. I think mentoring. To get mentoring from somebody outside your organisation is very, very helpful, because they will. I mean, generally, generally people are pretty trustworthy, especially in the internal audit profession. And so you can share your dilemmas and get some good impartial advice. It's actually, I think one of the toughest challenges actually of being head of internal audit is you don't really have true peers in the organisation. So
quite lonely, isn't it? Almost.
So I mentioned the word ally several times. You kind of have allies, and I think I think you must have allies. So and you need to choose those very carefully, but you don't have true peers, and that's that can mean that you are quite isolated. And you need to develop a network of people outside in the profession, or at least who know the profession, to get some sort of advice from, because you don't really want to go pouring your heart out to the chair of the audit committee. Not something I would particularly recommend.
The receptionist,
or one of your staff. I mean, it's not. Why wouldn't you do it to the chair of the audit committee? Well, they're not really. Their role is not usually really one of kind of caring for the head of internal audit. They're themselves pretty independent, spend limited amount of time with the well, with the company on whose board they sit. And that they often they have a day job.
They've got a balancing act, haven't they? They've got to keep everybody happy. It must be such a hard job, actually, to keep. They must know so much, and then have to be really careful about what they share. It's like when your friend tells you, they're having a baby or something, and you're like, who can I tell this to without that getting back to the wrong person? But that must be hard.
And they have conflicting loyalties too, because you think, well, I think perhaps I believed this too naively when I first became head of internal audit. The chair of the audit committee is on the side of the head of internal audit, right?
I thought that.
And I mean, fortunately that is my experience. But
Good.
But there is a limit to that. I mean, they are also on the side of. I mean, all of the board should want the CEO to succeed and should want the business to succeed. And if there's a conflict with the CEO or the CFO, it's not that you have to be realistic. They have to balance that out. And the same goes for the chair of the board. I've always had discussions with the chair of the board, and that's something I also recommend for the head of internal audit. Build a relationship with the chair of the board as well, if you can. Generally, they'll be pretty receptive, but in small doses. I would try once a year to start with.
Take me for a lunch.
They don't want the CEO to be in trouble.
No.
And your voice as a head of internal audit will be one of potentially many voices. So bear that in mind too.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I think we've had a really good conversation there about that topic. And do you know what? I've got about 5 more questions on my list, which I'm gutted about because they're all really good questions. I'll ping them over to you in an email, and you can email me back the answers. The last part of this is always a bamboozled question.
Okay.
It's a random question that we obviously haven't discussed before this. I do want to ask you the question around war stories.
Okay.
But what is the funniest interview scenario that you've been in? Either personally, so you've done something ridiculous, or what situation was just crazy?
I had it's I don't know, funny, not funny, I'm not sure, but it was certainly unusual. I did an interview once. I was working in China. I was a CFO of Shell in China for a job back in Europe, and I went to. They arranged a video conference, and you have to bear in mind this was kind of pre-Teams, pre-Zoom, etc., etc.
Pretty ropey.
I kind of found my way to some obscure office block in Beijing, and was guided in to what looked like somebody's office that they had just left. There was probably a coffee mug on the table, family photos, and I thought, is this really where they want me to do the interview? And I was told, yes, this is it. And I started this interview on the video conference interview. There were 2 people interviewing me, and their picture froze after 10 seconds.
Oh no.
And I assumed because they weren't saying anything that my picture hadn't frozen, and I thought, am I gonna say something, or am I just gonna keep going? And I thought, well, I'm just gonna keep going. And now the nice part of the story is that I think as a result, I was much more. Firstly, I was always looking at the camera. Which I think it's
really important.
Is a good thing to do, though, these days, because nobody looks at the camera. Some people find it a bit
intense.
It can be a bit disconcerting if somebody's kind of looking at you through the camera. But certainly, I think in those days it was better.
Yeah.
And I was I was listening, which I think is critical, and then focusing on getting my point across. I wasn't agonising about whether the people doing the interview were looking at their watch, which they may have been, and it went very well. The next time around, I got invited over to the country in question to have the next interview, but I didn't in the end take the job. But that was a funny experience.
It happens a lot nowadays. It happens a lot. The amount of times I hear from a candidate, technical issue. Go back to having interviews in person, I say.
Or just go for it. I mean, because I think one thing that all auditors learn, I think it's a great thing to learn, is that generally we can improvise. we can, you know, I audited once in Nigeria during a general strike, and had to kind of camp out in some office where there were 3 of us sharing a desk, sharing a desk designed for one person.
Yeah.
And you get used to improvising and hunting. I remember hunting for a LAN cable, and in some obscure airfield that was run by Shell in the middle of Nigeria, literally in the waiting room there was a LAN cable. I mean, you remember LAN cables, right? They're the things that we used to stick into our computers.
Yeah.
Before we had Wi-Fi. And I'd stuck it into my computer. I thought maybe this is connected to the Shell network, and sure enough, it was connected to the Shell network.
Thank goodness for that.
I mean, how
could have been awkward if it wasn't.
how that is from an IT security perspective, I'm not sure, but there's a lot of improvisation we need to get
the
used
good
to.
old days, the good old days. Well, no, thank you so much for joining us today, Peter. Really
Pleasure.
Enjoyed that conversation, and yeah, if anybody's got any questions, like I have still,
Sure.
ping them over in an email and we can share them.
Very pleased to do that. Thanks so much,
Thanks.
Julia.
No worries.
Thank you to all of those who've been listening.
Cheers. Bye.